part of the session. So we will have Ceren presenting shortly, like 15 minutes, and then we will have a discussion maybe, and then Miket Hoca will present the third paper she has, and then we will have the discussion again.
The plans have changed a little bit. I know that Kat Gibson assigned a list of 3 readings, I believe. And we can as well discuss those after my presentation. I tried to quickly read them yesterday, so we might do that. I mean, this is a little bit difficult because it's hard to represent Kath Gibson and to kind of also live up to her presentation. And it would be difficult to just perhaps present what we've been doing very recently, because it's very recent. Because in the last year, I actively started working with Kath Gibson. I'm originally a student of Julie Graham, the other part of Gibson Graham. But I have been in the community Economies collective for the last perhaps 10 years or so. And this is a collective that goes back 20 years. But the project itself has a history of 30 years or so. And it was interesting history to actually retell that the history of the group itself, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of point to some of the key ideas and perhaps strategies that are produced within this group. And then we can discuss the rest in the question-answer period. So perhaps one thing about the Community Economies Collective is it's a number of scholars coming from different places in the world, and they're mostly, almost exclusively, working with communities in specific localities. So there are groups working in Australia, in Asia, in Middle East, in Northern America, now I think South America. So there are various scholars that are affiliated with this collective. And the main objective is to reimagine our relations to economy, to reimagine the economy, and to do that, to be able to create possibilities for organizing collectively our economic relations. And one of the starting points of the group was to actually start rendering visible and intelligible and communicable different solidaristic, communitarian, collective economic activities that people are already doing in their localities. So this was a very strong part of the project, as well as contesting the representation of economy as a exclusively capitalist economy, or imagining the economy as a structural force or as a structural power that cannot be changed, to kind of shift or displace this representation. So one of the key ideas of doing this was an inspiration that Gibson Graham had from feminist critique, specifically the feminist critique of patriarchy. That's I think that was a very strong component of their first book, and also became a very integral part of the research project. And this feminist critique, which they talk about in the 1986 book, The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, is the feminist critique of patriarchy that they borrow. And this borrowing is an epistemic gesture. It's a methodological gesture. What they argued there was just like feminism provided a critique of phallocentrism, and by phallocentrism they meant valuing women only in relation to, as supplement, as complement, as an addition, as something inferior to men. So not having an autonomous space to think about women untethered to the identity of man. So according to them, feminist critique displaced this asymmetric binary, and the inspiration that they got from this was their own critique of, this time, capitalocentrism. Because according to capitalocentric representations of economy, they argued that all non-capitalist practices, transactions, exchange, laboring, enterprise, financial organization, were conceived, again, in relation to either as supplements or complement or inferior and ephemeral to the capitalist economy. So this was a very, I think, important idea that from the perspective of capitalocentrism, non-capitalism, what non-capitalism can mean even is not questioned, and a language for thinking about non-capitalism is inhibited, and one cannot really study the autonomous and independent or unique characteristics of these non-capitalist practices. But one cannot perhaps, you know, we can go one step further, one cannot perhaps even study capitalism because it's always already also conceived as some, you know, structural power. So how that got reproduced is also is not paid attention. So this critique, this feminist critique, they borrowed into political economy and call it a feminist critique of political economy, is also supported by two, I would say, they would say probably three, I'm condensing, two strategies for economic transformation, and I want to briefly talk about those two strategies. The first one was to actually develop a language for cataloging, mapping, understanding, analyzing diversity. So what are our resources, what are our tools, and what is the language that we need to produce to be able to actually talk about, let's say, diversity or heterogeneity of the economic field, and also to develop, you know, how to develop a conduct towards this diversity. So it's strategy about language politics, but also a politics of conducting oneself in this field of diversity. So this was, or this is the perhaps the first dimension that is to support this feminist critique of political economy, and it of course recognizes the performative importance of language in helping to name and also enact realities. And so one technology that is produced towards this end is the diverse economies framing, and this is the framing that you're seeing projected. And this framing is has a long history. It's produced through a reiterative process. So it's produced both drawing from various theoretical sources that the group has discussed over the years since 1982, I believe, and also it's a you know, language or the kind of categories of this diversity is also formed within the research collectives that the collective economies members work inside. So it's coming from the field, but it's also coming from both academic field and research academic field, or you can say research activist field and academic activist field. One thing probably that I need to emphasize, because it was important, the two columns, the enterprise column was actually, you know, reading Marx was a very significant theoretical background for that column. And you know, there are, of course, various readings of Marx, but there was a, you know, intentional reading, very much influenced by, you know, a series of Marxist political economists and philosophers to read Marx in a non-historicist way, meaning, you know, often pre-capitalist or relations or pre-capitalist modes of production were read in a sequential sense, in which you know, they come before capitalism and disappear after capitalism gets formed or repeatedly gets formed. This is what I mean by perhaps a historicist meaning. Okay, related to this reading is also the reading that Marx actually found the categories of class, reading or studying capitalism, and then applying those categories backwards into history, into the pre-capital prehistory of capital. So the reading this group got exposed to was perhaps a critical engagement with this historicist reading. Their own reading was influenced by Marx himself, but also the articulations of mode of production school in 70s, late 60s, but also the Marxist feminist school that studied reproduction and focused on unpaid caring and domestic household labor as a space to study patriarchy in relation to capitalism. I mean, this is a huge debate. Both these formations are full of contested positions themselves. But just to give you one of the theoretical sources is this particular intentionally anti-historicist, let's say, reading of Marx. And also the labor column is influenced, I think, by this reading. Yeah, we have forms of labor remuneration, different kinds of commensurate or incommensurate transactions, property forms, enterprise forms, and financial forms. In addition to the what we generally associate with a capitalist economy, which is wage labor, capitalist business, market exchange, private individualizing private property, and speculative mainstream finance. Okay. So this is, of course, a flattening of economic space. It's almost like you're saying, okay, let's put all these on the table, and and kind of deprive them of their a priori values and the values that we attach them. So it's kind of also a very, maybe, like a starting place. Of course, then, you know, the question is, raised is, how does one conduct oneself in this field of heterogeneity, or how do actual people conduct themselves in this field of heterogeneity, but also how can we think about transformative relations, forms, if this is the field that we are faced with. I mean, I'm kind of telling the story as if it's a linear story, like this question came after diverse economies framework. It didn't happen that way, but I think the principles of how one conducts oneself in this field was an important question. There is also maybe an implicit shift of subjective perspective in this flattening of the economic space. Because, you know, you might start with any kind of box. You might be, or you might have multiple of these relations ongoing in your life. I don't know, you might be engaging in an alternative capitalist market transaction. You might have a private property, but also engage in voluntary labor. I mean, you can occupy various positions within this diversity. So the question is always then, you know, if we want to move from this space towards more solidaristic, however we define that, and collective forms, then the process is going to be partial, and the process is going to go through negotiations. So the kind of total kind of change of the whole economy also is dropped. So this is like maybe an epistemic intervention, but behind it there's also a call for a subjective shift in terms of how one relates to these, I think, different relations in this space. But, you know, over, again, conversations with research groups, academic groups, there were, and also, you know, just studying the main antagonistic and contested sides of economic decision-making in different societies, the group came with kind of six, I think, six focus for concern, focus for negotiation, or concern for negotiation. I think I might have a slide for that as well. Sorry. Yes. So these were the. These were posed as questions for kind of talking, and especially in the local research groups, in the focus groups, these questions, I think, were the, and the diverse economies mapping were the starting points for conversation. So these six areas, the areas of needs, so negotiating over politicizing needs, politicizing and negotiating over surplus in enterprises and in, I don't know, households, in neighborhood assemblies. Third one was negotiating encounter with others, which is, of course, a border problem. How does one community interact with the outside of the community? So encounter was an important concept for the research focus groups. Struggling over consumption, struggling over and you know, maintaining the question of maintaining commons, and of course the area of negotiating over investments, what kind of investments, and of course that has something, I mean, all of these have something to do with how we relate to our wealth so that future generations also can live well. You know, there's that concern to all of these questions as well. Okay. So these, I guess, these questions kind of allowed us to continue to recognize economic diversity, but at the same time shifted from the neutral position of the diverse economies framework towards a more political space of what can be built in terms of community economies. So language politics and then politics of conduct, those were the big questions. And then more recently, I think the group, and I'm kind of included in this very recently, we just wrote a research proposal together. So this is something that I'm also reading more recently, but the group has been discussing this for a while now. A concern for developing technologies to kind of enact collective action. That we need, you know, not only do we need a language, and that language can be, of course, seen as a technology itself, a tool to kind of re-understand the economy. But at the same time, I think the group wanted to produce other kinds of metrics, ledgers, measurements that are that kind of codify the different kinds of ethical communitarian practices to represent those practices to the outside world, but also kind of self-audit, conduct a self-audit themselves while using these technologies. So self-audit became an important technology to conduct collective action, both within these research collectives, but also in the relation of the research collectives towards the governmental publics or you know, non-governmental publics. So the problem of how to measure, how to indicate, what kind of indicators to use to codify the different kinds of practices. And I wish Kat were here because her more recent work is about these metrics. But one metric that that I thought might be useful to look at is this technology of people's account, a kind of a self-account. I think this is from a cooperative. This is from a research being carried out in Amherst, together United States, with cooperatives, and I think this was one of the ways that the group self-audited themselves. So there are the number of hours of workday. And then the group was discussing, you know, how much to work, but also how much to work for survival or for needs. Of course, that's the whole discussion of what are the needs of the members. And then, you know, another significant question is the division of labor within the cooperative, and those who have skills more valued versus less valued. So the whole problem of the intellectual difference, or in maybe all like more general terms, the mental manual labor difference, all skill differences, and how to negotiate that along with needs. So negotiating over needs, negotiating over abilities, but also, you know, what to do with the profit. There are certain necessary payments, but there are also other decisions that might enter into how to use this resource. I don't know whether it should remain within the cooperative itself, whether it should be distributed towards environmental restoration projects. So this this allowed, I think, first of all, the cooperative to first kind of face its economic activities and its economic interdependency. So it's a tool, it's a technology to kind of place yourself in relation to different economic interdependencies. But also to start self-auditing, you know, what you value, what you don't value, and the very difficult decisions that, of course, a cooperative should make. Okay. And yeah, I have 3 minutes, but perhaps I should stop. One last thing. In addition to thinking about new metrics or new self-auditing technologies, I think that the other concern of the group right now is how to also develop certain, again, for lack of a better word, I might call technology, but maybe prototypes, in which one might transpose a certain, let's say, invention in a local context that created, let's say, a relationship between a commons sustenance and an alternative market structure. How can one maybe transpose that invention, because that relationship is an invention in itself. You're linking different nodes of the diverse economy to increase the well-being of a certain community. How to translate or transpose that relationship into other contexts so that they can be changed, I don't know, reiterated perhaps. That's the last research, let's say, question for the group. It doesn't mean that these diverse economies or community economies, let's say, negotiation areas are not rethought. They're also subject to a reiterative process, actually, in all these local research collectives. But I think there is more motivation now to interlink more localities with one another, and while doing that, think about ways of transmitting knowledge, not really imposing. Also, there's a very, of course, strong concern in the group not to, you know, devise blueprints. So something that is flexible enough, but also that carries a certain code of invention from one side to another. So the group is currently working, or a part of the group is currently working on that question. Okay, thank you.
We have now about 15 minutes for question and answers.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice presentation to get a feeling of the whole research program. I wanted to ask, the analysis seems to me, there is the part of the action research and then there is the part of the analysis, which seems to me to be static in the sense that you're trying, static, so it's like describe what exists, no? So what I wanted to ask you is if there is engagement and theory, either by Gibson Graham themselves or by people in the group, on the origins or how alternatives or alternative forms of economy, non-capitalist forms of economy, how they are created. So is there engagement with the question of how are they recreated, other from the fact that, okay, we want to create new ones, but of course they are created outside of the community program, of the community economies agenda. So how are they created? What's the theory of understanding? Where do these forms come from? And in relation, what is the theory or the underlying understanding of the group about the possibilities for transformative change? This I didn't understand. So is it the underlying idea that by doing many things of that, they will sum up and somehow they will substitute capitalism? Or is there a view that you have to also act on the level of the state? Or so what's the underlying vision of transformative change?
Hi, Marcel from Lund University, and I want to thank you also for a really good presentation, bringing together all the threads of your research group. It's very ambitious, and it's really exciting to see what's happening. Sort of leading off of the comment that Yorgos had just now in terms of an underlying theory for transformation, I was wondering if it was your use of the word node sort of made me wonder if you were looking at transition theory, if this is part of one of the underlying frameworks that the group is using to conceptualize the movement of innovations from one space to another, a node niche relationship, and political ecology. It's a bit problematic on the whole, but I was wondering if that was a part of the looking for innovative threads is using transition theory. And my other question was relating to the first graphic that was on the screen when you started. I was looking at the categories, and I have to admit I was a little bit worried because there wasn't, I was looking for sort of dialectical relationships to see if there was some kind of contrast between the different categories, and it seemed a lot more scattered. And there were several classifications I found problematic. Looking at slave trade in the non-capitalist format when it was very much a commoditized format, as distasteful as it was, and some of the other things are being attributed. I was wondering, in terms of the group's process in putting these categories together, how that happened in terms of being able to come up with these contrasting different categories going between the two, if it wasn't through a sort of a dialectical looking for contrast of what the process was. So thank you.
There is one more question there.
It's actually very helpful to see this put out like this, because it's makes you think about the relations between these categories. I also had a question, I think following Marcella's, which is that can you tell us a bit more about the relationships between these categories? Because historically, as you said, they've coexisted, and often some of these have been driven out by capitalism, so petty commodity production, etc., etc. So when I think of the literature about the relationships between these different kinds of economic activity, it seems to stress articulation, that these things are joined together, and the joining then changes each of these elements. So the way that you've posed these here seems to be a much more sort of binary opposition, that even if these simultaneously exist, they exist in opposition rather than other sorts of relations between them, relations which could involve joining, being subsumed one under the other, and so on. The way in which, say, housework is subsumed, unpaid housework is subsumed under capitalist relations. So if you could just tell us a bit more about the ways in which some of these might actually be helping in the reproduction of capitalist relations, some might be, at odds with them, or the other sorts of relations which might link all of these elements together.
Okay. underlying theories, if I'm not wrong, right? There are so many theories that the group has drawn from over the years. I think a critique of modernist readings of Marx was a very strong component in the beginning when the group first formed in early 80s. But over the years, as I mentioned, various feminist critiques of patriarchy, geography and anthropology, actually, in terms of the different, giving possibilities for naming relations that are not falling under capitalism or capitalist markets. I mean, those were very significant sources. More recently, I think a part of the group is turning towards or adopting some ideas from Bruno Latour's research collective, especially in terms of how they conceive technology as both composing of subject and object relations and as a necessary relation to enact transformation. But there's also, a part of the group that's much more engaged with a more, let's say, maybe psychoanalytical ideas of subjective change. So it's really, and the group is itself divided, and there are, of course, tensions, some of them productive, some of them take long time to work over, and we try to kind of make those meetings possible in addition to the research sides so that we can actually talk about how we are rethinking transformation and which sources we are drawing from. But what I might say is, I think in recent part of the, or in the recent history, there's a turn towards the question of subjective shift that is important or that is necessary for this economic transformation to happen. So there is that kind of emphasis. How can we develop also technologies to, let's say, open spaces where multiple subjects can come together, negotiate and engage in a pedagogical practice where each kind of shifts or doesn't shift. But how can we create spaces for that to happen? And in that sense, there are a lot of readings being done by the group. I don't know whether this is something that I...
What is it that drives the creation of alternative economies? Like in Greece now, after the crisis, we have a lot of community economies growing. So is there a theory from the group of why do we have a surge of these community economies in Greece now, and we didn't have it 10 years ago?
Well, the group initially worked with in different settings in late 80s, and there wasn't actually, I don't know, one context that the group worked is in the post-industrial Australia, in the after the closing of the coal mines. I forgot the region now, and the group that I worked with when I was a graduate student was with in the Amherst area, and it was a changing economy. Tourism was entering, but there was a very lively also service sector for culture and education, but also immigrant ethnic economies were just flourishing. So there was a semi-crisis situation. It wasn't it wasn't like the crisis that Greece is going through or Europe is going through. Or US is going through, but it was a more maybe regional redevelopment initiative that was starting, and our position was both cautioned against that intervention of turning, let's say, the Massachusetts area into a tourism, exporting tourism kind of region, versus motivating and encouraging these other local sites like bookshops, cooperatives, coffee houses, but also in the Springfield area, the forming immigrant collectives. So crisis is an important impetus, but I think it was not the only setting for the research. More recently, I think it might be the case, but I don't know. Yeah. And then someone asked about transition theory, but I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the transition theory. Is it a someone? Yeah.
Hey, yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on transition theory, although I do critique it. I mean, in essence, it's one of those theories that has been developing, and if someone else here is more of an expert on it, feel free to jump in. But it has been especially useful in innovation studies areas where they're looking at different ways. In urbanization context, for example, where nodes of innovative clusters of businesses can form, and it's looking at a division between the node and the niche, and how things move between a place where a instantiation of innovation takes place, and how that then gets moved up through the levels to become mainstream. So I think just from the process of us having this conversation here, it's clear that that's not necessarily the basis of what your group is working with if this is the first time you're hearing about it, although some of these ideas have been getting infiltrated through the literature in different ways. So that's why I was asking about it, to see if it was something that was at the fore of the thinking and discussions in your group, just because of the looking for ways that nodes of change get transmitted. It sounded like it may have been inspired by that, and I was just curious about it. Thanks.
Thank you for the explanation. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with it, but it might as well be that some other, I mean, this is becoming also, a very huge group that I'm talking about, and there are all kinds of difficulties of, some problems to do with representation and the kind of work we're doing, how to kind of coordinate that work. Might as well be some other members might be working, but I'm not familiar with it. And in the discussions that I was present, I also was not, I think, exposed to that theory. Well, the diverse economies framing, I mean, it might be a bit misleading, because I think I put a lot of different categories that came out from different research collectives there. So it's kind of an amalgamation of, so not all entries, are there in each collective, because the question is, it's actually just an inventory of what people do in terms of their economic activities. So it's like a initial mapping. We especially want to stray away from putting any moral judgment to any of the categories. So you might be engaging in these activities. This might be your starting point. If we're going to start from here and now, there are people who are working under, let's say, slave conditions. There are people who are working under alternative capitalism. So if we start from this site and this space and this activity, then let's build a conversation, first recognizing where we start from. So the map is, kind of the framing maps the places from which we're going to orient ourselves toward building, let's say, collective relations or structures. But the framing is also used sometimes to generate ideas. For instance, we use a version of this map actually in Diyarbakır because in Diyarbakır, you know, in our conversations, it turned out that 75% of the population are working in informal economy. But there's no disaggregation. I mean, it's a huge number. And probably a lot of them appear as unemployed in the official statistics. So we use the version of this diverse economies framing, not that we started a research collective there, but just to generate ideas about what kind of practices that 75% could be engaging in. So it can also be used as a kind of conversation starter to think about diverse economic activities. I'm not sure. Did I answer your question or?
No, it was more about how they actually came up with what went into it, what went into the different categories, because it could be contested that some of the things, how they're labeled as non-capitalist or non-market, doesn't seem to fit that category.
I see what you mean. Well, they're contestable, certainly. For instance,
That's why I brought up slave trade as an example, because that is very much a capitalist invention that commoditized. That was an enclosure of land and people, so having that in a non-capitalist enterprise category just jumped out at me immediately. It just didn't make sense next to worker cooperative, for example.
well, it's also, I think that's also maybe that's also point of debate in terms of how capitalism is defined. There is a very particular way of defining class in the group, and again, that also kind of was open to debate within the group as well, but also open to debate with audiences, which is based on the forms of production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus labor, rather than prioritizing market or commodity exchange per se. You know, the definition of class was specifically geared towards emphasizing the forms of surplus labor organization. So in that sense, one might engage in a cooperative selling their products to a market exchange, and we might categorize that cooperative if the labor is collectively produced, appropriated, and distributed as a non-capitalist enterprise engaging in a capitalist market transaction. So we also kind of disaggregate those kinds of units into these separate entities. So commodity per se was not the defining commodity production or production for market per se was not the defining characteristic of capitalism in the organization or in the production of this framing. Maybe I'm done, right? I think there was a question that I didn't answer. Maybe towards the end, if you could repeat. I'm very sorry, but I'm going.
I just wanted to know whether in your framework there could be other relations between these entries rather than only relations of opposition. So whether the different elements of the alternative, non-market, the open access were actually connected to each other, and whether that fact of connection then changed the nature of these categories.
wage and unpaid.
No, opposed to wage.
Opposed to wage.
Whereas housework, for instance, is actually acting as a subsidy to forms of paid work which are occur within capitalist enterprises.
Sure. I understand what I'm understanding your question. Well, you know, the kind of motivation in constructing the table was to displace this binary. Actually, we wanted to stray away from this opposition. And the way to be able to do that was to come up with this gray area, which we call alternative paid, alternative enterprise. I mean, it doesn't fall in, it's the gray area that, or there are transactions, there are activities there that don't fall into that opposition. So that became actually our main, let's say, technology to displace the opposition. We started with the opposition, but we wanted to emphasize that gray, that ambiguous, or that changing kind of set of activities to actually be able to establish that displacement. And we didn't really think about relations per se. I understand what you mean. These are even not deconstructed enough because they come with certain relations. And that relation could be a relation to, that gives a condition to capitalism, that it might be a condition that runs counter to capitalist organization of surplus. Those kinds of discussions took place where we bring the principles or focus issues to the table. So relations become constructed, and whether they, you know, whether these categories or people that put themselves into different categories see themselves as supporting one another or undermining one another in terms of needs, in terms of how they maintain the commons, those questions become negotiated when we switch to the ethical coordinates that I showed after this slide. But in this slide, I know there are problems like you're saying, but we try to devoid all relations, all power, all norms from this as much as we can, and kind of really decompose.
Thank you. Now we will have the third paper. We will have until 1:15 for the presentation, and then again questions and answers.
Okay, it is in my third paper that I address, and in my third presentation that I address more theoretical issues as well, and perhaps also talk a little bit about alternative economies to a certain extent. My third paper is on transgression, what it means to transgress. And basically I use the concept of, okay, just let me say this. This is a paper which is not yet published. It's going to be published in a book, and the book is now tentatively called Vulnerability in Resistance, and it's edited by Leticia Sayer and Zeynep Gambetti and Judith Butler. And it's a product of a workshop that took place in 2013 in Istanbul. So, but this is, at least this is my final paper. So in this paper, what I want to, or in this section, what I want to talk about is a way of conceptualizing feminist political practice that, in a sense, I want to put the notion of ethics itself under erasure. I want to raise the issue of what do we understand by ethics. And I want to talk about being compelled to act in a certain way. I'm not talking about an ethical choice. I'm not talking about a kind of an ethical sort of position, but I'm talking about being compelled in a way to act that creates an alternative, that creates a different ethic, perhaps, in the end. And this notion of being compelled is something which I need to work on more. I find it very useful to think about this, sort of talking about relationships and actions and discourses under this general sign of being compelled. Okay. So I want to introduce the concept of transgression in relation to another concept which is not in the text that you have there, and that's the concept of alongside. So we can transgress something, or we can act alongside something, or we can act within something. So there are different ways. What I'm talking about are different ways of positioning yourself with regard to events, with regard to norms, with regard to, and I'd like to talk about the law. Okay. So, so my paper discusses what it means to have to be positioned against the law of the state. In other words, at least until a certain point, the Kurdish movement found it, or the Kurds themselves, I mean not the movement, found themselves positioned against the law of the state. But also, I want to talk about being positioned against the law of kinship. And I also want to talk about being positioned against the law of capital, if we can talk about such laws. So this is not necessarily a deliberate choice, but the result of one's place within a particular power structure. This morning, I mean, after I wrote this, I saw this guy who added himself to our Twitter account, to the Twitter account of Women Initiative for Peace, and his name is Mesut, which means happy. And then he says, underneath defining himself, he says, I'll say it in Turkish first, İktidar hayata hedef aldığında hayat iktidara direniş olur. It's so Kurdish. When the sovereign targets life, living becomes a way of resisting the sovereign. So, I mean, this is such a general kind of atmosphere within which the Kurdish movement operates, that this is what I want to talk about, this is what I want to understand as a kind of being compelled. Okay? On the one hand, the feminist position of women and peace is a deliberate taking place alongside the law of the state. So the paper talks about transgression, whereas the women in peace is a kind of more of an alongside the law of the state. So what we're doing is asking for the implementation of United Nations Decision 1325, which is to have more women involved in peace talks. Going ahead with our own fact-finding missions and engaging in talks with women parliamentarians and women combatants are all acts that neither transgress the law nor are positioned firmly within the law. Not asking for funds from NGOs, European or local, is a way to stop us from being compromised by being associated with bad Europeans, especially in this climate of sort of nationalist kind of reaction, but also it's also a way of keeping our independence and our effort to make our statements the product of our own thinking. And even taking the Kurdish movement and the Turkish parliament as the two sides of a conflict is an act which verges on transgression. Using examples from other parts of the world where states negotiate with non-state combatants or guerrilla movements, we try to keep open a space from which we can talk legitimately about two sides. So we're trying to make the talk about two sides a positioning not against the law but alongside the law, and this is our basic sort of effort. In other words, the Women in Peace, Women Initiative for Peace itself is a balance between, or tries to strike a balance between transgressing the law and being alongside the law. So we position ourselves alongside the nationalism of the Turkish state, rather than taking it as a totality that need to be done away with. So we don't take it as something to be criticized, not condoning it, but not deliberately speaking out against it as a sort of constructed unity called nationalism. What we're doing is to act, to speak out again against particular actions of the nation state, which can be seen to be the product of this kind of nationalism. These kinds of acts that are alongside the law, ultimately, we hope, we believe, erode the law rather than mount a frontal attack against it. So this kind of erosion, there's a whole literature in anthropology from James Scott onwards on informal, I mean, Ceren also mentioned it in the economics as well, in development economics, informal sector, the black market, encroachment side. For example, Asif Bayat talks about quiet encroachment. These are all ways of making a living under conditions of being compelled to live in difficult conditions. But what we are trying to do is to build the politics out of this rather than just, just a life. You understand what I mean? I mean, it's taking that building seriously and making it a politics. Kurds displaced from their villages during the 90s have had to build a life from scratch in the large metropolises they settled into. This is my research, 2010. I didn't give any papers on that, from that work. In Mersin, which is a large town, a city on the Mediterranean coast, where about 40% of the Mersin population is now Kurdish, which means that Mersin is understood to be a Kurdish town. And that's the reason why I did work there. The only way that these Kurds who came to Mersin could actually establish a life there was to position themselves alongside the law. This positioning placed them in the middle of heterogeneous practices regarding many aspects of life. So we're not just talking about the economy here. And I want to take my examples from a wide array of aspects of life. Telling stories, for example, of a bygone way of life in the name of constructing Kurdishness for the young people in urban ghettos who have never seen that life, for example. Or shops extending purchases on credit with such long-term returns that they end up by being gifts. Or producing charcoal on the derelict site of a wasteland among sheep herders and farmers who are also trying to eke out a living on the outskirts of the town, and whose attempt, in the effort to try to put together some capital so that they can start another business somewhere else. And these attempts basically constantly fail. You also have people looking after sheep and goats on the flat roofs of their houses in the village, in the city. You have this kind of these different lives intertwined and living together. Keeping kin relations intact as a way of coping with poverty and uncertainty, while at the same time belonging to a political movement that foregrounds women's liberation as its own guarantee of success, and therefore is against the male domination in kinship relations. Okay? And other practices, so we're talking about other practices of life that in the end are made up of a diversity of practices that all attempt to keep life intact. To build a life is the term that I want to use, and it's a term much larger than the economy. As Gibson Graham suggests, we need to critique the notion of the economy as a technical issue that has its own laws of operation and place it, once more thinking anthropologically, within politics. Building a life, to me, is such a term. It's a term which is both technical and non-technical, both particular and universal. It's a holistic term. That's why I say it's sort of thinking anthropologically. Anthropology defines itself as a holistic form of social science, doing social science. Transgression and alongside, these two terms, I take these as being two modes of opening up alternative spaces to speak and act from. In my paper, I try to show that being placed against the law itself is a space from which alternative forms of imagining and speaking about women can emerge. Genealogy, and I'm using it, the Turkish Kurdish form, because there's no, I don't want to say gynecology, it doesn't mean that. Genealogy and the notion of the culture of rape, which I discuss in the paper, are such discourses articulated from this position of transgression, of being against the state. But it is also alongside many different theoretical positions, ranging from Foucault to Althusser, to Deleuze to black feminism. And this position, I mean, many of these aspects of genealogy have been developed by Abdullah Öcalan in prison, where he read more books than you can ever imagine in your life. He has the time. And this is also a way of speaking against the nation state, against capitalism, against the academy, and any other node of power. So being both alongside and being against can be simultaneous. So we can talk about a post-capitalist politics that is also a post-nation state politics. So does the notion of post-capitalism also bring us to a position of post-nation state politics? This, in fact, is the Kurdish political movement's final proposition to us now. It's moving away from I don't need 5 more minutes. So we can, the Kurdish political movement is now moving away from the aim of establishment, from establishing an independent Kurdish state. It used to sort of talk about TC. TC are the initials of Türkiye Cumhuriyeti, the Turkish Republic. So even that statement was in a kind of against position. Today, however, what they want to do is a politics of building what they call democratic autonomy, a form of devolution and local government based on the Swiss models of cantons. So what you heard on Tuesday from the Rojava representatives were the political and legal sort of frameworks of the 3 cantons of Rojava. Okay. And this kind of democratic autonomy is being produced by creating spaces of autonomy alongside the law of the state. For example, the example that I gave you about the guerrilla cemetery. The guerrilla cemeteries up on the mountains, the Turkish state doesn't touch them. There are normal cemeteries down below, and they both work alongside each other. Okay? So this is the building, this is the building that the Kurdish movement is involved in at the moment, and it's based on the building of these spaces rather than an attempt to construct a new nation state. Thank you.
Now we have around 20 25 minutes. Sandra was proposing to give a short answer to this before we have the. Yes, we set the in +1. If you can keep it short so that we have time to make the question and answers, but you will have to come here because we don't have the microphone.
Well, my thoughts. My thoughts right now.
It worked. Yeah. Okay. Or maybe I can just project. Okay. I don't want to keep. Yes, I don't want to keep you because my ideas are barely forming. I'm very interested in this idea of the connectedness of these two relations to law, being alongside and transgressing the law, like having both those moments together in the Kurdish movement, and what that implies. I mean, I don't know, but in previous conversations, I was thinking there are probably two different ways of rendering the state redundant. Exposing yourself as a vulnerable subject to the state and taking up the position of, penalizing almost in your own hands. That's how I understood, in one sense, the vulnerability. And rendering the security state redundant in that sense. And versus setting up your own self-defense units. I mean, that's also rendering the security state redundant, but seems like two different ways. And I was thinking about like differences between these two rendering state redundant acts. I wonder whether one generates more guilt and defensive reaction against guilt in the other than like transgression, like maybe differentiating them also in terms of what these two acts trigger or insight in the position of the other. Might be interesting to think about. And then is post-capitalist politics and post-nation state politics? I think it should be, but if you're referring to the work that we've been doing in various ways, it's not quite that clear. I think it might be because when we think of community, because we use the concept community economies, and there community needs to be rethought. What do we understand from community? And there's some thinking going into that, keeping our distance from identitarian notions of community, but taking community, rethinking community as rethinking nation. I think that isn't there perhaps, but there are connections because I can see connections, even though I think you're very right to insist on building a life rather than reducing it to the economic register itself. Capitalist centrism in some sense also rested on the hierarchical division between the modern and non-modern. Just like the nation state, I think, when it constitutes its borders, relies on reproducing that hierarchy between who is modern and who is non-modern, especially in relation to Turkey. And that hierarchy, of course, draws from economic activities, and the development discourse. So there are, I think, constitutive moments of the nation and the, or capitalist, nation, the capital and the nation side. But I think we haven't considered probably the post-nation as a concept in our collective as rigorously as we considered community. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. This was fascinating. I have a question for both of you in conversation, which is the very different notion of politics that is articulated by both of your papers. The last one argued, and I fully agree with that, how the political as a transformative configuration is predicated upon the production, the making of a place or space for acting and speaking outside and alongside the state. So it articulates with, but is outside of it. It operates subtracted from the state. And is inserted within a vision, an imaginary, a fantasy that is both post-national and post-capitalist. And I very much agree with that understanding of what the political is. But that sits a bit oddly with the other notion of the political that emerged out of the Gibson-Graham analysis, where, strangely enough, it seems to me, while the economic is here seen as a heterogeneous assemblage of all sorts of socio-economic practices that articulate in a variety of ways with each other, but then in your second slide that followed from this one, you argued that the political as a space for contestation, negotiation, etc., emerges out of this heterogeneity of economic practices. So it's a very economically reductionist notion of what the political is. It emerges out of this heterogeneous socio-economic practices. In the other perspectives, the economic doesn't figure at all. It's about the construction, the constitution of a space for speech and acting within a political imaginary. And I would like to have a conversation between both of you about these very radically different notions of what the political is, yet both invoking a feminist perspective to construct this radical genius notion of the political as a process of transformation of life.
Thank you very much. Oh, this is loud. So I'm very much interested in the decentralization framework or ideas about decentralization you brought up in your final comments. And I'm thinking about what the level of engagement with decentralization, the experiences of decentralization in developing countries, what has been that engagement within the movement. Now, it's going to be a bit long, but my idea is that there's going to be a point where if this political project moves forward, we're going to need to codify the relationship of these autonomous spaces to the center, thereby redefining both of them, yes, by necessity. And then I guess there are two main models on how this can be done. One is that we adopt a model of a uniform administrative model that covers the entire country, and we become either a federal or a non-federal, but more decentralized country. The other is to organize this autonomy under some kind of exceptionalism, some kind of territorial or community-based alternative legal frameworks. And both of these models have a lot of antecedents in the developing world. I'm mostly familiar with Latin America, where you have, neoliberal waves of administrative decentralization, mostly from the top. And then you also have, most of the people here are familiar with, these indigenous communities and all Afro communities, other types of community-based rights that are exceptional. So I'm thinking, in the former, in the uniform model, decentralization can create huge variation in actuality, in what happens in the outcomes of decentralization. So sometimes when the community is strong, I guess, you actually get more radical democracy. When it's not, you mostly get a lot of corruption. Decentralization is not very nice in Latin America for many people. At least that's how I see it. And on the other hand, when you get the exceptionalist framework, it maybe gives more it gets realized better where it's affected, but maybe it's a way of co-opting the spaces of autonomy. Maybe it's a way of containing them. And the state effectively becomes a kind of discriminating monopolist, where you give each one the kind of autonomy they deserve somehow, that they can get from the state. I don't know, I'm a bit pessimistic, I guess, but I mean, I don't want to be. And I think we need a model of some sort. But I think we need to be kind of realistic about what we can achieve and kind of look towards the developing countries. Well, Switzerland, I understand as a model is a good one, but there are some experiences of countries that may be more similar to ours that have been going through this. Anyway.
Okay, there is a last question over there, and then we leave. 15 minutes for you to answer.
Hi, thank you for all of your inputs, and I'd like to maybe mention something now. It's been mentioned the second time of Switzerland. I'm from Switzerland, studying there. And it is mentioned numerous times in such contexts of decentralization, federalism, confederalism, etc. And I think it's highly problematic, considering that it's one of the most, I'd say, capitalist states in the world. 1/3 of all financial transactions in the world go through Switzerland. It's a tax haven. We have a race to the bottom between the cantons in taxes. We have crazy mailbox, mailbox companies of the mining projects that are talked about here. They're all located their headquarters are in Switzerland. It's very disgusting, to put it nicely. And so I think it's a problem that Eric mentioned before. It's how do we understand a decentralized political system that takes into account the economic and that is built up through an economic decentralized system? Because the decentralized nations, or whatever it is, whatever we call it, in a sense of purely political institutions, doesn't affect the economic positively in that sense, because it is based on similar property rights, monopolization, and accumulation. And it's a big question I have. I don't know. But how do you, especially in relation to finance that is movable, because a lot of these discussions are in relation to, natural resources. It's more a general question, but it's the link, it's a reaffirmation basically of the question that maybe Eric posed, if I understood his question properly.
You have 15 minutes for both, so try to keep it short.
I'm not quite sure how to respond. Well, maybe one thing about politics, different notions of politics. Well, my intention was not, it might have come across like that, but the intention in showing those two slides, one after another, was not to derive politics from heterogeneity itself. I mean, that rendering of heterogeneity calls for an effect, a kind of displacement effect, that there is no ground to the economy. That effect might happen, might not happen. Probably most of the time it doesn't happen, because we might as well see all those categories as parts of a capitalist economy, right? So now that displacement, is that politics? I'm not sure. I mean, it's a subjective shift of perspective. It might not be sustained, it might never happen, but there might be an opening, and that might be considered as a political moment, maybe. But then the other categories of politicizing the various focus or antagonistic areas, needs, surplus, all those questions are not necessarily drawn from the heterogeneous practices. I mean, some of them perhaps, some of those questions bear on the relations in those categories, but yeah, drawn from them, but their politicization, let's say a debate over what the needs are of the community, I mean, that's a site for disagreement, and maybe that's a site for partial convincing, of course, power relations and all of that, and that's a site of politics, perhaps, if we define politics as airing of disagreement, as imposing power, all of those things. Yes, that's politics. But it's a politics that rests on the assumption of a partial transformation, or a transformation of kind of one by one, like things come, rather than a total transformation. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you for your comment. You say that we operate with two very different, radically different definitions of politics. The interesting thing is that I really don't know. I mean, personally, I usually sort of work with a Foucauldian notion of politics, but what has happened to me personally during this kind of work is that that definition has undergone change. It has transformed. I mean, I still take sort of notions of a biopower, or the notion of the construction of particular subjects as political issues, but I also like to sort of look at a kind of more Deleuzian sense of politics of control, politics where the subject is not at the center of the discussion. So it is the fluidity with which the Kurdish movement, and me as a person who's looking at the Kurdish movement and analyzing them and placing myself alongside that movement, these are the transformations that I have been compelled to go through. And this, in a sense, I mean, you say that there's no economics in my understanding of politics. What I want to do is, I mean, this is exactly it. The notion of life I take from Deleuze and Thousand Plateaus and all the rest of it. I mean, it is something which, and even the notion of alongside, the notion of my alongside is the way in which is a kind of understanding that is between structuralism and post-structuralism in the Deleuzian and Guattarian sense. So politics will come in, hopefully, at one point, and it has come to the extent that I have done work with the evacuees in Mersin, in this town, where I understand politics to be kinship as an anthropologist, and I understand politics to be the economy as a Foucauldian, etc. So I guess although I studied Marx and all the rest, I was never a good, and my thesis was about petty commodity production and articulation of modes of production and all the rest of it. I mean, in the 70s, you know. In spite of all that, it seems that I agree with you. I keep sort of giving more importance to the word and to the way in which people imagine the world than necessarily to models and to structures. And that I find to be very Foucauldian, funnily enough. So economics will come into it, but to the extent that it is brought into the analysis through the research, through the practices that people are involved in, and through the extent to which it is articulated by the Kurdish political movement. And that is where Ceren comes in, because she has worked with the Kurdish political movement in terms of their, I mean, you heard on Tuesday, they're talking about cooperatives, they're talking about ways of creating this kind of alternative economy based on communes and cooperatives, in spite of the fact that until now, you don't see them actually going towards building cooperatives, building these kinds of alternative spaces. There are 2 or 3 different attempts, most of which have, I mean, one of them is not a failure, but it's not really an alternative. The other one was an alternative, and it's a failure in Viranşehir. You know, so there are. So they will come in to the extent that they will be transposed into words, again, but I think that does not necessarily pit me against Ceren, because, I mean, we have just started this conversation. I mean, it's this workshop that has started this conversation with Ceren, really, the relationship between post-capitalism and post-nation state. And I think that this will, you know, I mean, my hope would be that maybe we could do something with all this, you know. I don't know if that is an answer or not, but yes, you're right, and that's a problem, and it's an issue, and I put it in front of me. With regard to the decentralization, and in a sense, this is exactly what your point is all about as well. I mean, can we think of a decentralized political system that takes account of the political? I don't know. Yes, I mean, that's... In a way, why is the term canton used in the Kurdish political movement to describe this kind of decentralized model? They use it because they're talking about forms of direct participation in politics. So they're talking about these neighborhood councils, the neighborhood councils that are then, if you like, balanced out by neighborhood parliaments. So at all levels, they are sort of, this is the imaginary, I mean, even the Women's Congress is organized in the same way. They are supposed to be sort of checks and balances. The committees and sort of locally acting units, councils, being balanced by, again, same level parliaments. The word they use is meclis, parliament. So, and this they believe, this they think is the Swiss model. But yes. No. I do agree. So what they do, I mean, you heard when Çınar was talking and Abdul Salam, when they were talking about Rojava, they were talking about these people's houses, the women's houses. These are interim sort of organizations that will produce the canton model in the end. And the cooperative question that somebody asked, they weren't able to answer properly. I mean, so in a sense, you saw the whole thing in action there. The link to natural resources. Ecology is a very, very important aspect of the Kurdish political movement. There are, for example, many acts of illegal acts. They burn, for example, work machines that try to extract, let's say, gold or copper in the Kurdish mountains. The mayor of Diyarbakir was reported as saying that they would take taxes out of the oil that is being mined in the Kurdish regions. So there are these kinds of disparate statements that emerge, but I don't think that they still know what they want to do with, or how they're going to organize their ecology, or how they're going to organize the relationship to natural resources, and how, I mean, all of this is going to function. With regard to your idea about a model, they don't work with models, these people. I mean, they read about them, but then they always appropriate and transform the models in their own way, with their own experience. So, for example, if they take the Swiss canton model, they don't take the economic aspect of it at all. Some of their ideas about direct democracy and cooperatives comes from Murray Bookchin's notions of democratic autonomy and direct representation, but then they get transformed with what they can do and what they have done. So they look at, I mean, it's very much a politics of possibility, the way, in the sense that Graham Gibson defines the term. They look at what they have and what they can do with what they have, and a short-term aim. So, so I don't think that models work in the same way for the Kurdish political movement that they have for other forms of politics.
I don't need to impose a model on it. What I meant to is, if you project the process forward, it's maybe my ignorance about the process itself, but what I meant, the question was, if you project the process forward, what kind of decentralization do you see being codified?
As I said, they don't work with that. I mean, they cannot work with that. At the moment, what have they done? Look, they've formed a political party which has managed to break the threshold with 13% of the votes, and they don't know what, and we still don't know whether we'll have a government or we will have another election. And these are the real conditions under which, you know, people have to work. So, I mean, the question of the existence of a Kurdish political party in parliament as a party for the first time, what does that mean in terms of models to create a kind of decentralized, more, I mean, my hunch is that, you know, we're going to go very slowly, in the sense that, you know, we're going to go towards a little bit more decentralization, hopefully, or we may go back to scratch if, you know, depends on what will happen within the next, you know, 30 days.
Thank you very much for this conversation. Yes.
Shall we start with the second part of the session? So we will have Ceren presenting shortly, like 15 minutes, and then we will have a discussion maybe, and then Miket Hoca will present the third paper she has, and then we will have the discussion again.
The plans have changed a little bit. I know that Kat Gibson assigned a list of 3 readings, I believe. And we can as well discuss those after my presentation. I tried to quickly read them yesterday, so we might do that. I mean, this is a little bit difficult because it's hard to represent Kat Gibson and to kind of also live up to her presentation. And it would be difficult to just perhaps present what we've been doing very recently, because it's very recent. Because in the last year, I actively started working with Kat Gibson. I'm originally a student of Julie Graham, the other part of Gibson Graham. But I have been in the community economies collective for the last perhaps 10 years or so. And this is a collective that goes back 20 years. But the project itself has a history of 30 years or so. And it was interesting history to actually retell that the history of the group itself, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of point to some of the key ideas and perhaps strategies that are produced within this group. And then we can discuss the rest in the question-answer period. So perhaps one thing about the Community Economies Collective is it's a number of scholars coming from different places in the world, and they're mostly, almost exclusively, working with communities in specific localities. So there are groups working in Australia, in Asia, in Middle East, in Northern America, now I think South America. So there are various scholars that are affiliated with this collective. And the main objective is to reimagine our relations to economy, to reimagine the economy, and to do that, to be able to create possibilities for organizing collectively our economic relations. And one of the starting points of the group was to actually start rendering visible and a priori values and the values that we attach them. So it's kind of also a very, maybe, like a starting place. Of course, then, you know, the question is, raised is, how does one conduct oneself in this field of heterogeneity, or how do actual people conduct themselves in this field of heterogeneity, but also how can we think about transformative relations, forms, if this is the field that we are faced with. I mean, I'm kind of telling the story as if it's a linear story, like this question came after diverse economies framework. It didn't happen that way, but I think the principles of how one conducts oneself in this field was an important question. There is also maybe an implicit shift of subjective perspective in this flattening of the economic space. Because, you know, you might start with any kind of box. You might be, or you might have multiple of these relations ongoing in your life. I don't know, you might be engaging in an alternative capitalist market transaction. You might have a private property, but also engage in voluntary labor. I mean, you can occupy various positions within this diversity. So the question is always then, you know, if we want to move from this space towards more solidaristic, however we define that, and collective forms, then the process is going to be partial, and the process is going to go through negotiations. So the kind of total kind of change of the whole economy also is dropped. So this is like maybe an epistemic intervention, but behind it there's also a call for a subjective shift in terms of how one relates to these, I think, different relations in this space. But, you know, over, again, conversations with research groups, academic groups, there were, and also, you know, just studying the main antagonistic and contested sides of economic decision-making in different societies, the group came with kind of six, I think, six focus for concern, focus for negotiation or concern for negotiation. I think I might have a slide for that as well. Sorry. Yes. So these were posed as questions for kind of talking, and especially in the local research groups, in the focus groups, these questions, I think, were and the diverse economies mapping were the starting points for conversation. So these six areas, the areas of needs, so negotiating over intelligible and communicable different solidaristic, communitarian, collective economic activities that people are already doing in their localities. So this was a very strong part of the project, as well as contesting the representation of economy as a exclusively capitalist economy, or imagining the economy as a structural force or as a structural power that cannot be changed, to kind of shift or displace this representation. So one of the key ideas of doing this was an inspiration that Gibson Graham had from feminist critique, specifically the feminist critique of patriarchy. That's I think that was a very strong component of their first book, and also became a very integral part of the research project. And this feminist critique, which they talk about in the 1986 book, The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, is the feminist critique of patriarchy that they borrow. And this borrowing is an epistemic gesture. It's a methodological gesture. What they argued there was just like feminism provided a critique of phallocentrism, and by phallocentrism they meant valuing women only in relation to, as supplement, as complement, as an addition, as something inferior to man. So not having an autonomous space to think about women untethered to the identity of man. So according to them, feminist critique displaced this asymmetric binary, and the inspiration that they got from this was their own critique of, this time, capitalocentrism. Because according to capitalocentric representations of economy, they argued that all non-capitalist practices, transactions, exchange, laboring, enterprise, financial organization, were conceived, again, in relation to either as supplements or complement or inferior and ephemeral to the capitalist economy. So this was a very, I think, important idea that from the perspective of capitalocentrism, non-capitalism, what non-capitalism can mean even is not questioned, and a language for thinking about non-capitalism is inhibited, and one cannot really study the autonomous and independent or unique characteristics of these non-capitalist practices. But one cannot perhaps, you know, we can go one step further. One cannot perhaps even study capitalism because it's always already also conceived as some, you know, structural power. So how that got reproduced is also is not paid attention. So this critique, this feminist critique, they burrow into political economy and call it a feminist critique of political economy, is also supported by two, I would say, they would say probably three, I'm condensing, two strategies for economic transformation, and I want to briefly talk about those two strategies. The first one was to actually develop a language for cataloging, mapping, understanding, analyzing diversity. So what are our resources, what are our tools, and what is the language that we need to produce to be able to actually talk about, let's say, diversity or heterogeneity of the economic field, and also to develop, how to develop a conduct towards this diversity. So a strategy about language politics, but also a politics of conducting oneself in this field of diversity. So this was, this is the perhaps the first dimension that is to support this feminist critique of political economy, and it of course recognizes the performative importance of language in helping to name and also enact realities. And so one technology that is produced towards this end is the diverse economies framing, and this is the framing that you're seeing projected. And this framing is has a long history. It's produced through a reiterative process, so it's produced both drawing from various theoretical sources that the group has discussed over the years since 1982, I believe, and also it's a language, or the kind of categories of this diversity is also formed within the research collectives that the collective economies members work inside. So it's coming from the field, but it's also coming from both academic field and the research academic field, or you can say research activist field and academic activist field. One thing probably that I need to emphasize, because it was important, the two columns, the enterprise column was actually, reading Marx was a very significant theoretical background for that column. And there are, of course, various readings of Marx, but there was a, intentional reading, very much influenced by, a series of Marxist political economists and philosophers, to read Marx in a non-historicist way, meaning, often pre-capitalist or relations or pre-capitalist modes of production were read in a sequential sense, in which they come before capitalism and disappear after capitalism gets formed or repeatedly gets formed. This is what I mean by perhaps a historicist meaning. Related to this reading is also the reading that Marx actually found the categories of class, reading or studying capitalism, and then applying those categories backwards into history, into the prehistory of capital. So the reading this group got exposed to was perhaps a critical engagement with this historicist reading. Their own reading was influenced by Marx himself, but also the articulations of mode of production school in 70s, late 60s, but also the Marxist feminist school that studied reproduction and focused on unpaid caring and domestic household labor as a space to study patriarchy in relation to capitalism. I mean, this is a huge debate. Both these formations are full of contested positions themselves. But just to give you one of the theoretical sources is this particular intentionally anti-historicist, let's say, reading of Marx. And also the labor column is influenced, I think, by this reading. Yeah, we have forms of labor remuneration, different kinds of commensurate or incommensurate transactions, property forms, enterprise forms, and financial forms. In addition to the what we generally associate with a capitalist economy, which is wage labor, capitalist business, market exchange, private individualizing private property, and speculative mainstream finance. Okay. So this is, of course, a flattening of economic space. It's almost like you're saying, okay, let's put all these on the table and kind of deprive them of their